Hello and welcome to today's webinar. We are here today talking about navigating Google Privacy Sandbox. And we've got today our VP of Kochava Foundry, which is Grant Simmons, and our Chief Technology Officer, Ethan Lewis. If you missed part one of this webinar, don't worry. There's lots to talk about today. And we also have, you'll notice in the Docs tab over on the right of your screen, there's some summaries from part one if you're interested in checking those out. But this is in no way a continued conversation that you can't just jump into with us here. So if you missed part one, don't worry about that. And if you want to access it, you can do that as well. So you'll notice on the right side of your screen, there's a few tabs over there. The first one is chat. We really encourage you to jump in and join us. We would love to have your interactivity. So the first thing you can do is speak to our community manager today, who is Leslie Amadio. Hi, Leslie. And she will invite you to let us know where you're tuning in from. We'd love to know where people are coming from. There's also a polls tab over there. Grant, at some point during the webinar, will let you know when a poll is open, and you can live answer that, and we'll share those results so you can see what's going on there. The Docs tab I already mentioned. That's where there's some supportive documentation in case you want to learn more about certain topics that we're going over. So you'll see that. And then the Q&A is where you can add your questions, and we'll try to get to those at the end and answer the questions that come in live. Now, you may have also noticed when you registered that you were invited to submit questions. We did have some people submit questions upon registration, and those are incorporated in the talk today to try to make sure that everyone's questions get answered to the best of our ability. We are not speaking for Google, obviously. And so there may be some things that we won't be able to answer, but I think there's a lot of interest in this topic. There's a lot of just questions about what's included in Google Privacy Sandbox, how is it going to impact my business, and on what timeline. And so Grant and Ethan are going to cover a lot of those topics today. I would love to have everyone also on the chat, if you wouldn't mind, share what your role is at your company. It's interesting for the audience in general to just kind of see who else is watching and what kind of roles they're playing in their companies and what makes them interested in this topic and how it's going to impact their business. So if you wouldn't mind, jump into the chat and let everybody know what role you play. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Grant to kind of kick us off. And Grant, if you want to hit that housekeeping slide, and we'll make sure that we covered everything. I think we went through all of that. The one thing, I want to remember this. Everyone always asks, is this being recorded? Can I access it later? The answer is yes. For all registered attendees, you will get an email after the event, including a link to the recording. So if there's anything that you missed or you want to go back and listen to, you will have access to that afterwards. So with that, I'm going to introduce Grant and Ethan, and I'm going to drop off, and I'll see you back at the end of the webinar. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Kimberly. Appreciate it. Hey, and welcome back, everybody. Thank you again. So this is, we've done a few of these things. And the last one we did on Privacy Sandbox, and we sort of laid that out and talked about what are sort of the big frameworks. And we're going to get into that again today. We're going to get a little further down the path, and we're a little further along in testing. We expect that many of you might be further along in testing too. So we're gonna get into sort of where we are. But before we do that, again, thank you for the pre-questions. Some of those that we'll bake into this presentation as we go through. I encourage you to ask questions as we go. We'll try to pick them up on the fly. While one of us are talking, the other one can take a look at questions. But suffice to say, if we don't get your questions answered in the webinar today, we will be doing a write-up from all the questions we submit. So you will get your questions answered. So why are we talking about all this? And I think it's important to do a bit of a recap of the last few years. And we're going to start again with WWDC 2020 and what was announced largely on the iOS side, which was the introduction of the StoreKit ad network and the app tracking transparency framework, which basically said, unless consent is captured through Apple's app tracking transparency framework, all attribution will go through the StoreKit ad network, which is aggregated, delayed, and basically is a much different world than most performance marketers have been living in. So when we look at the effect of this, first off, this is through the end of 2024. we're in the middle of doing a to date one. So, keep watching this space. The version of this to date will be coming out shortly. But what we see is that deterministic identifier, the IDFA, went from roughly 20% of all iOS attributions to roughly about 8%. And probabilism, which is what's known as this, euphemistically called fingerprint attribution of an IP and user agent concatenation, really hasn't changed in terms of a percentage, but the makeup has. Meaning if we go back to 21, most of that was user acquisition through third-party networks. And if we look at most of the probabilism now, it's folks relying more on their own media. These are, if you're a Kachava client, these are more smart links used in emails and social posts and things like that. So think earned and owned media. And so the next one's the self-attributing networks, right? Of that big sand block over on the left-hand side, most of those used to be social networks that we all know. And, the StoreKit network actually completely hamstrung that. And so in terms of self-reporting network claims, most of those are now going through the StoreKit network, which is that, 8-digit bit protocol to describe all of your media to how it's converting on your devices. And so, again, I don't want to unpack like how it's delayed and how it's aggregated. Again, you can go back and look at some of our earlier webinars that we unpack that. And then finally, Apple search ads. When StoreKit Ad Network rolled out, it scared a bunch of money into Apple search ads because that's where folks could continually get answers. And so the net here is that Apple as a publisher service makes up about 67% of Apple attributions now. And so that's the Apple side. So what's Google doing? Well, I think before we talk about what Google's doing, I think it's important to understand the importance of Google. We just talked about iOS. Let's recognize that most devices are Android devices worldwide, about 73%. And when we talk about marketing, more than half of that, when we talk specifically performance marketing, it is an Android device being marketed on a Google property, right? That is 56% of all attributions take place. It's a Google network marketing an Android property, right? And so we talk about what's happening in iOS. Holy moly, what's happening in Google is actually a heck of a lot bigger if we just think raw volume. And so all of this, when we talk about Privacy Sandbox, and we'll again unpack that in a little bit, all of this fits under this notion of privacy enhancing technologies. And so what we wanted to do, and I'm going to bring Ethan into the conversation now. And it's funny with me chatting with Ethan, he's our CTO, and every time we chat, I learn something new and different. And so I'm going to hand over to him real quick, because when we talk about the secure multi-party compute, that was completely new to me. The trusted execution environment, again. So I'm going to shut up for a few minutes. Ethan, I'm going to let you go and sort of unpack this for the crowd.
Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate it. And certainly a fun topic to discuss. So, I think why we really wanted to have this slide up is privacy enhancing technologies have really been a term that I think's been getting a lot more traction through folks like the IAB and other, advertising industry leaders that can help conceptualize how these tools from a technical standpoint can get some names attached to them. So what we thought we would do is, just for some of the Privacy Sandbox components that we're going to talk about today, really just identify and highlight which type of privacy enhancing technology techniques are leveraged. So, last time in our webinar, we talked a lot about the event level reporting and attribution reporting API that Google Privacy Sandbox has offered. That's really around the aggregated and k-anonymity models that can be done with data coming across. Today, we're going to be focusing on a couple other of the techniques, which is the topics API, as well as the protected audience API. And that's where we start to fall into the various other categories of privacy enhancing technologies. So with secure multi-party compute, that's a really fancy term to just more or less say how we can do cryptography mechanisms across multiple parties and share the encrypted results through key exchanges. Trusted execution environments are just what they sound. They are an environment where execution or compute can take place in a trusted or verifiable fashion. And an example of that within the Google Privacy Sandbox lens is, again, the aggregation service that we have to spin up for attribution reporting API. That's an example of the trusted execution environment. And then we have things like on-device learning, we'll get into it, but that's really where the Topics API and Protected Audience API come into play, where we're actually on device keeping track of things like contextual parameters or interest-based parameters around how users are performing certain attributes on device. And then obviously differential privacy really is a collection of tools that summarize how you can operate more effectively in a privacy lens. So whether or not you're doing things like limiting the amount of queries that can return a result set if there's under 100 or 200 result sets, but really just putting in privacy guarantees within your overall application and product to ensure that you're not exposing a user's data specifically. So what I think is really interesting about this is pets, while they've been a topic for a long time, SKAdNetwork and Google Privacy Sandbox are really some of the first in-market examples that we're seeing that are using exactly and using a lot of these techniques to really address some of the privacy concerns within the digital advertising landscape.
Yeah. So if we think about that as it applies to Privacy Sandbox, and we talked about this last time, the Privacy Sandbox really has a couple different components. And we've heard about this notion of cookie deprecation. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. And that's largely sort of open web. What we're going to really get into today is again, what's happening within the operating system on Android. The one question I want to bring up, and it's a question that's been asked, like, when's all this happening, right? That is the big sort of elephant in the room. And quite frankly, I'll say it for the audience, we don't know. But we can anticipate that the cookie deprecation will happen, even though it's delayed. Maids have not been announced that they're going to be deprecated, but the signals appear to be there. If you were to hold a gun to my head, I would say probably about fall of next year. But I don't know. What's your speculation, Ethan?
Yeah, it's a great question, and obviously wish we had more concrete deadlines. But I think the interesting trend to look at would be the iOS side with the rollout of SKAdNetwork. And what was really the driver of that was the ATT prompting that took place on device. We haven't lost deterministic signal on iOS when we have consented users, but we sure see a lot less IDFAs through the pipeline for deterministic attribution purposes because of the consent frameworks that are rolled out. So, I think web is another example of where that's taking place, where we do have third-party cookie deprecation and we do have more first-party consented applications being pushed out into market to satisfy things like CCPA and GDPR and so on and so forth. But I think that's the trend that we should be looking at closely is, will Android be pushing out more privacy guarantees that start to lose the made signal that we would see coming from the Android device? And will that help forecast when we see these privacy capabilities completely masking what's possible from at least from a third-party deterministic attribution standpoint?
Perfect. So let's get into it a little bit. So we're going to talk about, if I can get to the right slide. So first off, the first poll question. So it's the exact same poll question we asked last time. And I'm gonna open this guy here real quick. You guys should see it on your screen. Let's see if I did this. Oh, I think I have to stop sharing to share this. Well, something else is being shared. Yep. So let me do this. I'm going to share this guy. We're going to ask. So have you started testing on Privacy Sandbox? And so we get some votes flowing in here real quick. And as we go through this today, we're going to unpack a few different things. We're going to talk a little bit about topics. We're going to start, though, with the Protected Audience API, and then we're going to get into attribution and the opportunities around event reporting, because it's much different than the StoreKit ad network. And ultimately, there's sort of an interesting, I'll call it nexus, where an MMP sort of fits. And so we'll get into the what you can expect from MMPs and the role of the MMP going forward. So what's interesting is the last time we asked this question was, have you done any Privacy Sandbox testing on Android? It was exactly 50% said no. It was 44% had said yes. And no, but not planning to, was 44%, and 7% was yes, they have started. So Looks like we got a new cohort of folks. In terms of how it worked out last time, yeah, it's what this tells me is folks are still looking for answers. So let me close this here real quick. I'm going to start sharing the presentation again. There we go. So we shared this last time, and these are the components that make up what is the sandbox. And so taking it from the left, where do you want to start on this? Ethan, do you want to start on the attribution?
Yeah, I think we can just do a recap of the attribution and SDK runtime, and then hit on some of the other. Yeah,
cool.
Yeah. So I think when we're thinking about the privacy changes, obviously there's various components that come to mind whenever we're starting to look at new techniques on how to get at the same results, and specifically from the MMP lens. Obviously, one of the big topics for us is attribution reporting API and what we should expect to see from a reporting capability from Google Privacy Sandbox. So we'll go through a couple recap slides, but attribution reporting API is really the exhaust or the byproduct of Google Privacy Sandbox when it comes to how users are targeted, retargeted, or how they are actually showing that a conversion took place due to an ad campaign. So that's very traditional to what you would expect to see from something like the SK ad network. The reports are a little bit different. In my opinion, Google's taking it to a pretty good place for a V1 standpoint from a Google Privacy Sandbox, where Apple took more of an iterative approach on some of their rollout of the multiple versions of SK ad network. But we're really hitting the ground running with two forms of reports from attribution. One is a slightly delayed event level report, which is going to be leveraging most likely for optimization of ad campaign and ad signal. You don't get as much granularity around the conversion signal, but you can understand the effectiveness of your ad campaigns through the event level reporting. On the flip side, you have aggregated level reporting, which is more delayed. It starts to have more granularity into the conversion tracking that you can start to pull within the report and understand the user journey and optimization of pathing of your users. So, really interesting approaches. Or the SDK runtime rather is something that we're really excited about from a development standpoint, looking at how we can help streamline our SDK for adoption of things like Google Privacy Sandbox and other platform capabilities like universal linking or deep linking capabilities, and really gives developers a way to manage those third-party SDKs within their application. The remaining two, Topics API and Protected Audience API, are really the solutions for first targeting, which is the Topics API, and remarketing or retargeting, which is the Protected Audience API. Yep. So stepping into a flow example like this, the Protected Audience API is largely responsible for the remarketing or retargeting of a user. So going from this diagram, it's a little complex, but this is what it will likely look like from the mobile lens. Is a user will visit the advertising app. From that, an MMP SDK, a partner SDK, or even the individual developer can use the Google Privacy APIs to call in to register that visitation within the advertiser app. And that is one of the key elements that makes that user retargetable across other publisher apps. That all lives on device. Once that call is made, it gets stored on device and later can be used within a ad auction or ad request when a publisher has the opportunity to serve an ad avail. So stepping into the publisher lens, user visits now a publisher that has an ad unit available. The SDK for the publisher lens will make a request for that specific ad via the Google Privacy Sandbox API. They'll be able to look up any of the information on that specific user and the available networks that are eligible to bid on the ad request, and ultimately serve the winning ad. So a lot of really unique stuff here. There's a lot of granular details to unpack around what I would say are rate limits of who can bid on that specific user, and how advertisers need to be thinking about how they manage their campaigns across multiple DSPs or ad networks that they are working with. And I think that's one of the more unique challenges that we're seeing across a variety of the Google Privacy Sandbox APIs is what your media mix looks like and how that's going to be impacted or not, depending on certain rate limits and quota limits that Google Privacy Sandbox outlines. And what I mean by that is there's a fixed number of ad buyers that can go into the available ad request. So if you're running with 100 networks today, likely not going to be able to run with 100 networks in the future. That number is changing, but it ranges from a couple dozen to around roughly 25 that can be added and eligible for bidding on the ad impression.
Hey, a couple questions around this. So is there anything like this on Apple? If I think about retargeting and suppression, meaning there's a suppression play here also in terms of truly protecting an already engaged audience that you don't want to serve media to. There's nothing really like this on the iOS side, is there?
No, not currently. It's a great call out, and I think that's where you can start to see the thoughtfulness that has gone into Google Privacy Sandbox in these ways. And suppression's a really good call out that we're just now starting to crack the retargeting on SK Ad Network through some of their new re-engaged views in reporting, but certainly not a way to forego serving an ad to the user from that standpoint.
Yeah, another question. We got a question here from Mohammed Gamal from OMG. How would I use my first party and website data under a protected audience API? How do I use my first party data?
Yeah, it's a great question. So per this diagram, the key element is you have to have access for protected audience APIs to work to the user directly. So the very first step here is the user for eligibility for retargeting needs to have visited your property. So how you can kind of think of that at a high level is if a user for the very first time lands on your page, that is likely either through topics. There could be a topics API that drove the user to your website, but it's not through protected audience API. Once that user lands on your page, and let's say your outcome is to drive a purchase or an add to cart type of capability, that's where protected audience really starts to shine, where you can say, hey, this user landed on my page, they had intent, I want to try to retarget or remarket to them at a later date. So you're more or less dropping an audience profile within protected audience API, and then giving the chance to bid on that user if they don't perform the action that you want to drive from an outcome standpoint. So by nature, protected audience API is via your first party audience. That doesn't mean you have to have a cookie. It doesn't mean you have to have a device identifier. It just means that you have to be operating with the protected audience API to set this audience data and visitation data on device for an ad auction to take place later.
Gotcha. Hey, we got another question here real quick, and I want to sort of keep this one in the back of our minds as we go through the rest of this, this one's from Jennifer Chang, and she's asking, how do you foresee customers using middleware technology? So think like CDPs, CEPs. How's that going to get impacted by all of these different frameworks, particularly when the MAID goes away? Right.
It's a good question. How I would look at it is there's definitely opportunities to adorn certain attributes with the user themselves. And a lot of that is piggybacking off of the first party data rights that you have to your audience. So from the CDP side, or from something like a data enrichment play of a user, I think that's still a potential to where you could operate with a middleware to look at the user information that you have. Potentially it's a first party email address, for example, and adorn more information with it that could be used to further enhance the contextual information that via the topics API or protected audience API. So that's certainly one way. From a data exhaust standpoint, I think it really depends on how and where we land with the event level reporting and the aggregated level reporting to see what we can do from a cohorted audience standpoint based off of that data.
Yeah, and a question had just come in from Akshat Ganja, which is if cookie or device IDs aren't identified for the protected audience API, what is the identifier? Well, we're
Yeah.
going to get into some of those event encodings, and that's where the magic's going to happen here in a couple slides. Yeah, let's move on a little bit. We're going to talk about topics API. We're going to come back to some of these themes. I wanted to show this really quick because I had gotten a new computer here a few days ago, and this is the first time, so I set up a new Chrome instance on it. And this is how topics is being messaged to just the layperson, which is, hey, good news, you're going to get more useful ads and you're going to get characterized. And your two options are a customer is either got it or go to settings and try to carve around it, which I tried to do and is actually not as easy as you think. So the good news is that topics data will be populated. Will it be granular enough to use in any sort of meaningful fashion? I don't know. But actually, that's my 2 cents on topics. Ethan, I'll let you chat here for a sec.
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting to see it out in the wild, and that is one call out that we should make. We obviously have a diverse customer set, but Google Privacy Sandbox really is getting introduced on the Chrome and web side as a early adoption, and the mobile side is, I don't want to say lagging, but certainly trailing some of the developments on the web. So a lot of interesting learnings that we can do there. And obviously the cookie deprecation is something that I think we're all well aware of. And while it was pushed, it is still intimate on when it'll be launched. So again, the main thing that I think about with the topics API is this is where you have the opportunities to start doing some type of interest-based or contextual profile of the user from how they're navigating and leveraging Android properties. So whether or not it's Chrome or on the mobile side, the APIs that are available are largely providing the ability to say that this user has determined to be interested in something like your app category, which could be a sports betting app, or your website category, which could be a news application. And that's data that can then be later targeted through the topics API via even things like protected audience API or further just ad auctions that are taking place. So, a couple differences here. Google is calling this interest-based advertising. I personally like to even refer to this as contextual advertising, but I know there's multiple forms of contextual advertising. So the big call out here is this is separate than just leveraging on-page context to build a profile for an ad, right? So what the topics API is not saying that you visited a website where you're reading an article about, Game 7 in the NBA Finals and then being targeted ticket sales. That's more traditional contextual advertising. This is largely trying to understand how the user is interested in certain contextual categories as they're utilizing specific applications that they've visited. So similar concepts, and I think it's something that, going back to the pets call out, is really looking at on-device learning models or even federated learning models to figure out how we can safely target users that are showing intent and interest in certain contextual categories.
Yeah, let's get into, we got a bunch of questions coming in, and I'm going to I'm going to put them out there because I think as we get into the event level data within the attribution reporting API, I think much of this will get answered. But one question is from Jason Anderson: can only one entity who set the audience bid on the audience, or can you assign it to another entity potentially? Meaning, there's been talk that Google will allow for this for web. So will it be the same for mobile? Can we anticipate that? I'm not sure. We know. I would expect if they offered it for web, it's probably going to be available for mobile.
Yeah, and that does go into some of the registration on eligible users that can bid against the specific user, and some of that's set up like on the on the protected audience API. You're providing a list of ad partners that have the capability to bid against the user that has visited your site. So those would typically be networks or DSPs that you're running with as an advertiser, and that can be used across multiple partners.
All right, let's get into the event level reporting. And this is, to me, where the magic sort of happens. And in terms of how things are joined and how things will be joined in a post-made world, many of the answers are going to lie here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, calling out that this is post the protected audience API or the topics API. So in order to fill that ad slot, you can imagine that the topics API was leveraged to add or adorn information on an ad request, or the protected audience API had registered a prior user and made them eligible for an ad request to take place. So what we're showing in this diagram here is really what the registration flows are for specifically attribution. First, residing within the publisher application or the ad serving application is where we're registering what's called a attribution source. That's a fancy term for registering a click or an impression. So after an ad request, when an ad is displayed, we have the opportunity to register that an impression was displayed or register that a click took place. That information, again, is stored on device via an attribution source. And later, depending on where that ad took us, let's pretend that it took us to the App Store and caused us to install an application. Later, then we have the opportunity to register what's called a trigger. And that's typically what we call or refer to as a conversion or a post-install event, et cetera. So for an example, we could register that the app was installed, or we could even register something like the app was installed and a purchase event took place within the app, and we want to attribute that to the attribution of the attribution source or click and impression that took place. So when we're talking about what identifiers are used, this is where for event level reporting, we have to put a tin hat on a little bit and try to understand how attribution is going to be performed. And that's a little TBD that I think will be awesome to see what the Foundry team produces on some further analysis. But my understanding would be that the on-device, specifically, at least for event level reporting, will look very similar to a last click model where we're receiving just the last attribution source that was registered on the device and the first attribution trigger that took place. What the result of that is what is referred to as an event postback. And that's what really contains the attribution data, which we'll see here in a coming slide.
Yeah, we got a couple questions. Actually, we got a point from Matthew McElwain here. He's saying, according in reading the most recent UK CMA report from the ICO on the GDPR standards, it's quite likely that the current configuration of some of these APIs might not fly. And I think we've seen that before, right? Coming out of Western Europe, that the best, the best proposal that's floated out there within the development community oftentimes hits headwinds when it hits particularly GDPR. So I think it's reasonable. We'll probably see some tweaks to even the structures and the timing and the delays and some other things within the API structure. I think it's pretty reasonable.
Yep. Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And I think to take it further as well, if we see certain trends that took place with Google Analytics and Google UA4, we might even see pullbacks of the API support within certain regions initially. And that's something that we are obviously paying attention to and having a lot of conversations with partners on. But certainly would say that a lot of what Google has produced is being scrutinized and up for debate on what the final version and release will look like post their beta offering.
Yeah. And we got Jerome Turnbull asking, hey, what do the tracking URLs look like? And I think let's use that question to sort of talk about, in this case, the MMP. And whether it's Kochava or whether it's AppsFlyer or whoever you're using, it's sort of a critical role in the unification to join all of this across your networks. And it's really at that tracker level. And so, as an MMP customer, you can expect that you'll still have a macro which will carry the necessary key value pairs for you to be able to do creative breakouts and site breakouts and and decomps at the OS level. The point there being, in terms of your tracking URLs that you're getting from your MMP, it's your MMP's job to solve that for you. And so there shouldn't be a ton of hiccups in terms of having to retrack traffic, tracking URLs and things like that. We plan on taking care of that for you. Anything else there, Ethan?
No, I think the only thing to call out is, per this diagram, a little bit high level, but if we were to zoom in on something like the register attribution source, this is where a lot of the conversations with partners have been taking place. There's some mechanisms that allow either the ad server or the ad network that is responding to a ad request to look up what the actual registration of the attribution source should be. But there's also capabilities to forward that data onto someone like an MMP partner. So we've had a lot of conversations with our media partners, and are coming up with a lot of really interesting flows on how best we can traffic URLs without causing a re-trafficking use case. What I will call out, though, is very similar to the SK ad network. I expect that at least for a period of time, we will still see traditional clicks and impressions coming through via the MMP tracking URLs, and they may or may not be eligible for certain probabilistic and deterministic attributions. So that may change as more privacy constraints get pushed out. But initially, I think one of the strategies that we'll be leveraging is looking at that signal as a cross compare on the delayed signal that we're getting from Google Privacy Sandbox, whether or not whether or not we treat it as the source of truth or not is a little TBD.
Let's get to this notion of source of truth, and we got a question here from Jorg Fitzner from Stillfront, and he's saying for the aggregated attribution reporting, who owns and operates the key management service, and who decides if it can be trusted?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, kind of a couple things to unpack. The key management service is something that Google has partnered with, and there are third-party key managers that are specifically generating your public and private keys that are going back into that multi-party compute element of the privacy enhancing technologies. So that's a long-winded way of saying we somewhat know who the key managers are. It's not Google, but they have partnered with third-party vendors to generate the keys, and they surface those keys to us as you're registering for the aggregation service and spin up. From the trusted execution environment standpoint, in order for aggregated reporting to work, we've had to spin up SaaS technology referred to as the aggregation service that leverages our encryption keys in order to decode signal from other parties in the space. So we own and operate the aggregation service for our customers in that scenario. And that's, again, kind of the exhaust from those event postbacks and aggregated reporting postbacks that comes through and gets aggregated to where then we have APIs to pull reports from. So a lot of moving parts, but hopefully that help answers the question.
Yeah, last question on this from Jorg was, and this is what we're looking at on the screen here, for the event level attribution reporting, can multiple events be reported in sequence over an indefinite app usage time?
Gotcha. Yeah, so that's a good question. I believe there is a similar notion of a look back window similar in the SCAD sense, meaning if we had an attribution source registration that took place, I'm just going to make something up, but 7 days prior, I believe that does have a fallout on what the attribution trigger eligibility would be to look at that. I'm not 100% certain on the exact duration. It is larger than SCAD, and you don't have to do as much trickery around like keeping the attribution window open. Meaning like dropping bits to not force the event
window
trigger.
Open to be able to collect that next conversion event. Gotcha.
Correct. Yep. So I would say, it's not open indefinitely. You can track multiple events. You can register multiple triggers, But as it relates to the attribution reporting, there is a notion of a look back duration that is enforced during the reporting
Hey,
capabilities.
let me ask you a question on, I'm going to back up here a little bit and go back to the retargeting function, the protected audience, right?
Mm-hmm.
When somebody uses, let's say, Kochava, there's a couple windows to play with there. There is, I've seen an initial conversion, and at what point in time am I willing to start talking to this person again? And then how long, once I start talking to them, am I willing to hold that window open to collect conversions? Is there that sort of dual timing mechanism on the Google side that we see?
Yeah, I believe so. So, you know, a lot of that is going to be into how the MMPs go about implementing some of the calls and how developers want to interact with making the calls. But certainly we can start to evaluate when we want to make the user retargetable based on their user journey within the application. So, you know, if you were thinking of a traditional web page, and you were having a landing page that wasn't necessarily showing high intent users in the outcomes that you wanted to drive, you can forego targeting or retargeting those specific users until they hit a certain criteria or an event level criteria match based on the first party data that your application's observing.
Gotcha. Hey, we're at about 10 minutes before we wanted to open it up for questions. We've still got a bit more on event reporting.
Mm-hmm.
What else is sort of critical for folks to know here relative to what's happening with conversions to media?
Yeah, I think the big things to remember are under the attribution reporting API, there are two forms of reporting. We're hyper focused initially on the event level reporting, which is what we'll likely see being leveraged for campaign optimization. So that's very similar to what you would expect to see from the SK ad network. They're pretty correlative in how they're going to work. The flip side of that is the aggregated level reporting, which we're also implementing, but that's something that is more for the user journey and conversion tracking from the campaigns that you're running. So, you know, main call out there is one is for optimization. The other is largely for deeper analytics on how your media sets performing across the user journey.
So again, it's another trade-off of time versus grain.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think we covered this pretty well. Again, and I'll just say it for the cheap seats on that first one. In terms of click or engagement off of an ad, what's being baked in on the Google side is a bit more intelligence. You get up to 3 bits to describe that. For impressions or a view through attribution, it's going to be 1 bit. And so you can think of it as just a pretty much binary. Do you want to view through attribute to an ad that may or may not have been seen by a human being? You'll have that option. All right, let's get into, this is an example of the payload that we sort of expect. It's what we're testing around, but let's talk about that MMP going forward. And so, you know, you and I had chatted about this, and I love how you laid out, hey, what is measurement gonna look like going forward?
Yep.
Yeah,
absolutely. So I like to think of things in 4 primary categories, and there's a lot of strategy that I think goes around some of these. But the first one, going back to even the graphs that you displayed, the deprecation of identifiers has not been fully pushed out. They have been guarded around consented parameters, ATT for iOS. Google has permissionings that are wrapping at GDPR, CCPA, et cetera. But a lot of the regulation focuses on the third-party tracking capabilities and not the first-party capabilities, which I believe will still be present from a consented standpoint going forward. So what we should expect to see from a deterministic standpoint is a likely lower percentage of users that have consented and opted in for tracking, but largely the same mechanisms that are used today for attribution and performance media, right? So that's the somewhat good news. The bad news is capturing consent and capturing those flows from users has historically brought some friction in the user journey, and that's why we see the lower percentage rate. So interesting to see how that'll change over time. The next one, and what we've spent a lot of time talking about today, is what I typically refer to as platform frameworks or platform attribution. And that's largely where we're looking at the massive platforms in the space and leveraging tools and technologies that they've introduced. So for iOS, it's things like Apple search ads, where we can do Apple search ad keyword attribution reports. It's SK Ad Network. For Android, it's Google Privacy Sandbox, and a lot of the capabilities that they're pushing out, including even things like Google Refer. And it'll be interesting to see how that changes over time. And then we kind of go back into the remaining two, which is this notion of continuing to step in and lean into your first party data and understanding how you can do crosswalk of first party identifiers in a data clean room or trusted execution environment to achieve the attribution reporting and capabilities that you're looking at that you would expect today. So a lot of variation in how that can take place, but data clean rooms and what I would say is really just first party data ownership is certainly another upcoming category that is continuing to grow from a customer engagement standpoint. And then the fourth one that I'm probably the most excited about is this concept of a modern MMM and always on incrementality measurement product. So the reason why I like that is we haven't spent a lot of time talking about cross device or digital out of home or CTV. These specific technologies are very restricted when it comes into cross device. They're in fact even very restricted when it comes from mobile web to in-app, right? Those are big challenges that you have to solve on these platforms. When we can start to look at something like our AIM product, that's where we're achieving the privacy guarantees that we want to see within market, because this is aggregated non-PII based data, but we're also getting that lens of a holistic approach across our entire media mix. So, super interesting paradigms and the driving towards those specific directions. But these four primary categories, I think, help me sleep at night as we're starting to see all of the shifts in the privacy landscape and what the platforms are doing from an implementation standpoint.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how much of this isn't theoretical. This stuff's actually in market.
Right.
You point to a lot of this. And you bring
Absolutely.
up the notion of CTV, which is, had we had this conversation 4 years ago, we would have just talked about iOS and Android, and that would have been the conversation. Right. We talk mobile, but really it's just connected devices at this point. And if we think about most of the conversions that, let's say, at Kachava sees, we see as many in smart TVs as we see in mobile devices at this point. How do you bridge it all together? Well, I'll say this, that clean room thing is going to do a lot of work for a lot of people going forward. Mm-hmm. And, this is, I think about, and even on this earlier slide, we talked about consented device. We can think of consented device in a world of just consented identity, which is a lot of folks have email addresses, and the ability to crosswalk using a hashed email address. Well, that's one application of a clean room. Using a RAMP ID, using Experian IDs, using your own first party data that you don't want to have leaked, but you want to have it joined. For instance, we do a ton of measurement for like Comcast properties, and all of that has to go through a clean room. It goes through this thing called block graph, which basically unwinds identity from both sides through a privacy friendly mechanism. So we can't unwind to their customers and they can't unwind to ours. But we're going to see a ton of stuff like this going forward. And in fact, for our next webinar, was thinking that we would do the next one on clean rooms. And we would talk through what clean rooms have been stood up, which ones are in play now, and where do we think this thing's going. And there's a ton of tech getting stood up around this right now. What are your thoughts on this, Ethan? We haven't talked about this too deeply.
Yeah, I am a huge fan of a lot of the data clean room technology that comes out. And I think that where my head goes at as a technologist and a user of the space, trying to understand how it impacts attribution and measurement, is what can we do with data clean rooms to approach or achieve as much as a real-time signal as we can? And two, how can we make them as interoperable as possible, right? So as we're talking about where data resides, and specifically as it relates to the first party data capture, interoperability of this technology is a really, really interesting place to spend some ideation cycles on. So, the cool thing is this is a lot more of a standardized term, I think, for people these days. And again, to your point, this isn't theoretical. A lot of it is in practice. We're seeing these use cases come out to support attribution, but also to support things like suppression or retargeting, et cetera. So definitely a really cool space to keep an eye on.
Dig it. All right. Hey, we're about at time. And I'm going to invite Kimberly to come back up here real quick. And while she's doing that, let's recap for folks where Kochava is specifically with Privacy Sandbox in our testing. I know that we're pretty far down the path. Let's just leave the folks with that. And then while we're going through that, again, encourage folks to ask questions. We got a couple more minutes. We can take a couple more.
Awesome.
But yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, so we have been in quite a few active conversations with partners, as well as just working very closely with GCP through the Google Privacy Sandbox working groups. Where we're at is largely working on testing with partners directly. So we have a number of partners that are ready to do attribution reporting. We have a number of partners that are leaning into the protected audience API. Those are the primary Google Privacy Sandbox services that MMPs are looking to integrate with. So building out a lot of technology to support those initiatives and what those flows holistically look like. So we've updated SDKs. We have a handful of test applications that users can go with, and then we're engaging very actively with partners and engaging on some real world use cases with those media partners.
Yeah, and in the meantime, doing an aggregation within our platform itself of what measurement will look like going forward, because all of it's going to be agged up a little bit, which is a much different world than a lot of folks have been living in. So we're trying to attack it at the reporting layer also. Yeah. All right, I'm looking if we got any more questions. We've got a bunch. I think we've answered most of them. We'll create written answers for all of this. And again, if you haven't already been to it, I suggest you go to the docs tab. There's some really good information in there. In terms of the flows that you see and the things that we went over, we'll make sure that all that's up there as well. Kimberly, anything I'm forgetting here?
No, I think it's great. I was going to mention the docs tab as well. One of the things that we did after the part one of this webinar was to compile the questions and answers into a blog post. And you'll see a link to that in the docs tab, but we'll do that again for this part two as well. So if you want to revisit any of that. There are a couple of other docs in that tab that also may be helpful to folks if you want to check those out and click through. And then I just super appreciate all the great questions today. It makes it so much more interesting when you submit your questions, and chances are if you have that question, others do as well. So I think it just makes it a lot more interesting. So thank you all so much for your participation. We do have regular webinars. We'd love to have you back for another one. We've got one coming up in June, on June 20th. As many of you know, Apple's WWDC is happening June 10th through the 14th, I believe. That's Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference. There's always lots of interesting things that come out of that. And so what we do as a team is kind of analyze what do those announcements mean for us and for others, for our customers and partners. So I encourage you to look for that one coming up in June. And if you follow Kochava on LinkedIn, we always post about our upcoming webinars. We also put a link to registration on our website a few weeks prior to each webinar. And then we will have another one coming up in July on strategies around Apple search ads, and that will be with Unity. So look for that one in July as well. We really enjoy engaging with you all on these topics. We also welcome your input on what topics you'd like to see us cover in the future. So please feel free to reach out and let us know what you'd like to see. But I think that's it for me. I really appreciate everybody joining today.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. We'll see you next time.
Everyone. See ya.